What's happening, everybody? It's Sean with Reactions to the Classics, and today we got another reaction to Marillion. We've been running some albums here. Afraid of the Sunlight, brought to us by a friend, longtime supporter, and by now, if you've been watching this video, you already know it. Super fan of Marillion. We got Joseph, otherwise known as Actor JSB. Thank you, Joseph. Appreciate you for all you bring to this channel. Just appreciate you in general. Thanks to all the patrons who make this thing go. If you'd like to support us in any way, check out that Patreon link below. The Patreon link on the end screen. I say it all the time, but we could not do this channel without them. We put up videos almost every single day. All right, this is all Joseph on this one. I do some research on this too. I did a lot of research on one of these songs, what the story was about. I'll get to that later on. But otherwise, Joseph's the expert here. I'm not going to pretend like I know more about Marillion than he does. So he says, somewhere on the Brave tour, manager John Arnes, which the Brave album is up, go check that out, held a meeting with the band and told them that despite the making of Brave having been a long, painful, and expensive process for the label, and on one which had yielded little in terms of commercial return, they were willing to finance one more Marillion album on the provision it was actually done cheaply and quickly this time. You know, like they'd asked for all the other times, yet that never happened. To the band's surprise, which holds to this day, they were able to achieve this, writing and recording for the first time in their newer and bigger version of the Racket Club. This was partly achieved by having producer Dave Megan come in an early stage in the jamming writing process to help out. As H explains in the 1999 remaster, quote, he did so by sitting in on the jam sessions, disappointing us to work longer hours and meticulously cataloging the emergent ideas. To some extent, Dave imposed his taste upon the direction of the music by selecting his favorite moments from the jams. Opinion is still divided in the band as to whether this was the right thing to do. Personally, I think it helped. That's what H said. The other side, which is basically just Mark, wrote in the same remaster. Although I initially agreed, I soon realized that we were giving up some creative control to an outsider in return for quick results. Part of the Marillion writing process is deciding what budding ideas we should work on to turn them into full-grown songs. With Dave involved, that process really didn't happen. We just worked on the bits Dave liked best. Though he went on to add, I'm not saying that Dave's taste is flawed. In fact, I would trust his taste over several members of the band, myself included. For H part, he added, I needed all the help I could get. The Brave album and tour had made mincemeat of my psyche, and I was pretty much a lost soul. Racked by self-doubt and emotional turmoil, I was feeling my life become unstitched before my eyes. Little wonder, then, that this album was to repeatedly examine show business and the damage done. All right, the music will not be in the video, but it'll be at a Vimeo link below, so click on that and follow along. Let's kick off with the album opener. It's one that I don't know how to say, but I do see, I cheated and looked at the lyrics. It is in the lyrics of the song, so H is going to tell me how. What I know is go with Gazpacho. Could be Gazpacho, Gazpacho. Could be a lot of things. As H elaborated more recently, quote, the overwhelming theme of the album was people self-destructing through the pressure of their own success or fame. And that's writ large in Gazpacho. It's written large in King, and it's written large in Out of This World. So those three songs particularly were about self-destruction. So it made a lot of sense once we got into alluding to O.J. Simpson and Mike Tyson, to spin in the whole car chase scene with the helicopters over that. Lyrically was very, very contemporary. It was coming out of what was in the news. So you'd see what was going on with O.J. Simpson. You'd see Mike Tyson being done for rape and Kurt Cobain taking his own life. And the idea of this Spectre thing on Beyond You took us to the Lennon thing and the whole, this house is surrounded by helicopters, because Dave Megan had found this old recording of John Lennon being interviewed, pretending to be Phil Spector, talking about Phil Spector phoning him up after he'd absconded with the tapes for rock and roll. It's a whole nother story. Phil Spector was insane. Obviously, we know later on he's insane, the things he did, but he was insane basically from the jump. And saying the house was surrounded by helicopters and everybody was after him. So we're just trying to throw in as many examples as we could of great men melting down as we could. The Lennon quote in the opening is lifted directly from the famous Playboy interview, but is voiced by actor Bernard Hill and comes from the docudrama John Lennon, A Journey in His Life. Musically, JSB says it was driven by Pete's bass work, where he admits to channeling the great Chris Squire to use the driving force of the bass over what is a piece of quite commercial music if you analyze it. All right, I'm going to have the lyrics up as always. Thanks again, Joseph. All right, Gazpacho. I should have looked like 2 lines before it was macho, so he rhymes it with that. But really well done. I just like the sonic makeup of this, right? I don't know how to explain it. I just like it. I mean, I do see a little bit of the Chris Squire, of course, of yes, bass stuff going over it, but it has a pleasant sound, for lack of any sort of better word for it, but a really good way to start it. Now we get to a very interesting title. We got Cannibal Surf Babe. Joseph says, Ian recalls that this is one of the first tracks ever recorded at Racket. We did it in 1 or 2 takes, then we tried to re-record it somewhere else, and we could never get it to sound as good. H says, I thought it sounded like Motorhead when we were jamming that. I thought it sounded like Lemmy, quite rock and roll, a low rent kind of feel to it. JSB says, I don't hear that at all, but okay. Asked in 2007 to describe the first things that came to mind when thinking about the track, H simply said, The Beach Boys, Happy Days, Twin Peaks, which seems more on the money, JSB says. This track was mixed by the band's Seasons End collaborator Nick Davis and was intended as the album's second single, though ultimately EMI finally cut their losses and abandoned that idea. Davis enjoyed doing it, saying it was, quote, such fun to mix. I mixed it differently to how it was sent. I thought they'll love it or hate it. Fortunately, they all liked it. The coda features Barbara Limsey reciting the We're All Heaven's Children section in French over a loop of flutes, which originated in another jam called Icon, a track H noted he would have been happy to include on the album, but was outvoted 5-1. Okay, let's go. All right, Cannibal Surf Babe. Pete's bass is on point on this one too. So the first 2 songs, they're really showcasing Pete on here. This song, I like the start of it, and I like the coda, the ending of it. For a little while as it was going on, I'm like, is this my most hated Marillion song? Like, I could not stand it. The longer it went on, the more I liked it, which is to say it's maybe a little bit below average as a song for me. And I'll just kind of leave it. The lyrics are almost nonsensical. It's just a strange song, but I didn't hate it. And for a little while, I hated it. So, yeah. Next up's the third song, Beautiful. Joseph says, when EMI head Jean-Francois Sicilian signed off on the band doing a further album, it came with a familiar request for a potential hit. Mark recalls him specifically asking for a Crimea River, which seems an odd thing to ask anybody for in 1995, let alone a bunch of neo-proggers. But hey, at least he was only hoping for 1 rather than 3, which is what they wanted on the last album, and seemed pleased with that this is a good attempt when he heard it. As with Cannibal Surf Babe, it had been decided to have this track remixed, and Michael Brower was selected for the job. But no mix was forthcoming, so H called EMI, who said, we haven't heard from him. He doesn't like it. As H recalls, I've been lying in bed at night thinking, blank, we can't even give people money to work with us? Are we that awful? Suicidally, I decided to call the guy myself because I had to know. So I rang his manager in New York, and he told me EMI had never sent a tape. They just couldn't be bothered. Let's just tell them that he hates it. What's for lunch? Suffice to say, Brower loved the track, and it's his mix that you hear on the album. Joseph says ultimately it performed similarly to most H-era singles, reaching 29 during a brief chart stay. However, it was subsequently used in South American soap opera of the same name and became a big hit in Brazil, which no doubt accounts for it being the H-era song with the most Spotify streams, which is almost 15 million if you're wondering. On another note, the backing vocals are by Hannah Stobart, who would subsequently join Steve Rothery as lead vocalist for his Wishing Tree project. And this is going to be an inside community for us here at R2C, but no information available as to whether she is known as Bostart to her friends. Don't worry about that, but if you're in the community, you know what that means. Shout out to Chris. Let's go. Beautiful. What a fantastic song. Really, really showcases H's awesome vocals. Like, that was just so good. He just carried that song. I thought the guitar melody was really well done as well. Like, we don't have to get out here by Rothery and just go crazy on the guitar, but it's a very important part of this. But H is just fantastic. Great lyrics on here as well. And yes, it's beautiful. Like, it lives up to its name. One of the best vocal performances I've heard H give. Next up at number 4, we got Afraid of Sunrise. Mark calls this in the title track as non-identical twins born at the same time. A rare example of the band having 2 workable ideas to suit a particular lyric and ultimately keeping both of them. As H explains, the boys would jam and I'd be looking at these lyrics and thinking, okay, I'll try that on here. And then on another day, they'd have an entirely different groove going. And more often than not, when that happens, one or more of those ideas goes into the bin and the other one gets developed into fruition. With that one, Dave Meegan was really reluctant to give Afraid of Sunrise up because he liked the feeling of it, the Joni Mitchellness of it. He even called it Joni. That was a working title from the ground up. Okay. All right. Afraid of Sunrise. Really good song. Love the melody on that. You know, in some ways, it's a soundscape. Reminds me a little bit of Gazpacho, like not exactly the same, but the way I like just the sound of it, the environment of it. So it's really well done. The lyrics are a little abstract, but like I said, H sounds great, and the guitar melody is the star. Next up, we have Out of This World. JSB says, I don't know if Donald Campbell is a name that will mean anything to you, but there's an opportunity for you to go into a research rabbit hole about him in general. The Bluebird in particular, and this song's direct influence on events surrounding both in the past 25 years. if you so wish to. Oh, I don't mind if I do, but let me finish reading your stuff first, JSB. As H explains, the subject was something he'd been carrying in the back of his mind for a long time. It started during a newscast when I was 7 or something. My mom was crying as this strange lobster-shaped thing did a backflip and exploded into the water. And I remember thinking, oh, I wonder what's up with Mummy, and her explaining that it was a man losing his life in a very fast boat. So that just stayed for me for years. He subsequently wrote the opening lines in the 80s before the mood of one particular jam session led him to revisit and complete them, adding, I thought of it being a little bit of a love song about his wife's take on it. Now maybe he doesn't love her enough to take his life in his hands like this. Made it into something more than a bloke just driving fast over water. Steve Rothery says, I'd say it's one of my favorites. I love the mood of it, the pictures that we paint. I think the solo works perfectly within the context of the motion that we're trying to capture. Well, I did a deep dive on this, and it was incredibly interesting. Donald Campbell's dad, Sir Malcolm Campbell, set all these records, speed records, right? So Donald Campbell set all of these records, and then he just wanted to keep going. So he set a land record, and he'd already set a ton of water records. So he's trying to break the record on the water, and he makes a run, and he does really well. And you're supposed to, I was reading this, let the water calm down, but instead he went right back up again. And I mean, that's the story. That's what H saw. It flipped. It killed him. But there's a lot to this. So if you want to go research Donald Campbell and Bluebird, if you've never heard of him, I suggest you do it because it took up a good, I don't know how, I didn't time it, 30, 45 minutes of just fascinating stuff. Guys that want to break speed records are just built different, right? He was trying to go 500 miles an hour on the land. Just some crazy stuff. But as so often, I don't think these guys can really stop. I think it's just in them, right? So you're going to go until something bad happens or you get so old you can't do it anymore. All right, Out of This World. Once again, a good soundscape. Not a ton of lyrics. It's about, what I said it was about Donald Campbell, but H kind of stretches these lyrics out. The song's a bit long for me. Like, it's almost 8 minutes long. I know it's kind of the idea, but it's a bit long for me. It's a bit dragging in some of the ambiance parts, but it's still a really good song. Now we'll get to the title track, Afraid of Sunlight. Remember, we had Afraid of Sunrise. Describing the lyric as lending itself to an American road movie, H recalls singing the lyrics and conjuring the vast wilderness and heat, then stepping out of the studios into 2 feet of freshly fallen snow and nearly skidding off the road on the way home is quite a contrast. Steve Rothery simply says, if the mood's right, then creativity can be effortless, and lists the title track alongside Brave's The Great Escape is probably my all-time favorite Marillion songs. Well, okay, that puts a lot of pressure on this one for me. All right, Afraid of Sunlight, a fantastic song. Just fantastic. You're probably thinking, Sean, it's a longer song like Out of This World, but I thought it just did a fantastic job sonically, and H's vocals are great. Just one of those songs that gives you a great vibe. You can really feel his emotion in these lyrics. So yeah, just fantastic. All right, we got 2 tracks left. We have Beyond You. H notes, when we wrote Beyond You, it had a certain kind of darkness to it that led us to the Righteous Brothers. You've lost that loving feeling and all that while we were putting it together. And so we said to Megan, could the whole thing be an homage to Phil Spector? And he embraced that wholeheartedly, trying to use all the same technology. So we had tape loops that ran all around the room. He mixed it in mono, so the whole thing was a Phil Spector fest. So we had a lot of fun doing that. It's not about missing someone and having to drive away from someone you're in love with. But what's wonderful about the song is the atmosphere of it, the darkness of it. What Mark did with the chords, those beautiful suspended chords and choirs, and it's just so delicate, really. And at the same time, it does make more of a nod to Spector without really sounding like a ripoff. I think Dave managed to imbibe the thing with so much soul and ghostliness. For me, it's exquisite. It's one of the band's high points. All right, Beyond You. Basically in the lyrics, he can't get beyond her no matter what. He knows he's not much of a man, but he knows he won't get over this, right? It's a story of feeling hopeless and helpless because you can't have the person that you love. But once again, a really good melody and great sonic soundscape there. Kind of building on Afraid of Sunlight. Very good there. Now, Joseph says, before we get to the closing track, a slight diversion to mention something that sprang from the publicity shots for the band, which played on the Great Men Melting Down theme by featuring lookalikes of some of those referenced in the album. OJ, Elvis, Mike Tyson, along with Napoleon. Played by Pete, which is a bit rude. Napoleon wasn't that short. Ooh, shots fired by Joseph. And an astronaut. One night on the U.S. tour, H got to chatting with a fan called Rick, who asked what the astronaut represented. The conversation went something like this. H said, that's meant to be Buzz Aldrin. He says he came back from the moon a slightly different man. Rick says, that's strange because his entire album is like the story of my dad's life. H says, who's your dad? Rick said, Neil Armstrong. H said, you're effing joking. This led to the band having a few encounters with Armstrong Sr. over the years, including a time where H drove him to Heathrow and thoughtfully asked the first man on the moon whether he was going a bit too fast for his liking. And now return to your regular scheduled album closer, which you see below. It's King. In H's words, this track, quote, brings the whole thing to a head to some extent, I suppose. Gazpacho is written as a commentary about a guy out walking on his lawn and beating his wife up, whereas King is more about the inside of that person and how he perceives what's happened to him. So that's from the inside looking out, how you cope with the consequences of your own success and how inevitably the ensuing mess breaks around you and you haven't actually got time for yourself anymore and you don't feel like a real person anymore. So in that sense, Gazpacho and King book in the album. Joseph says, of course, there's a lot of personal stuff from H mixed in with that. Quote, I was struggling with life, the universe, and everything. My marriage was in a bad place, and so was I was just generally burnt out by having a bit of the rock star excess. Kurt Cobain's recent suicide was seemingly on every musician's mind at this time, but there was an extra frisson to it for Marillion. We did this gig at the Terminal 1 venue in Munich, and it had been Nirvana's last gig. So I was the first person to walk up to the mic there since Kurt, and that was a weird feeling because of the whole thing about his suicide was still very fresh, and there were a lot of things going on at that time that I was very open to. We've never had that kind of success, never been the biggest band in the world. I think we'd have split up years ago. I think that's probably true for almost everyone. All right, King, just a fantastic build of instrumentation, right? Up until the very end. Probably the best verse on this whole album. And you're sick to your stomach at the sound of your voice and the shape of your face and the sound of your name. They'll send you pictures of yourself. It's someone you don't know. And they call you a genius because you're easier to sell. But the fire in your belly that gave you the songs is suddenly gone. And you feel like a fake. Is that what you want? I thought a really good introspective lyric there to finish off this album. And now we're going to get to my favorite tracks. Honorable mention, I'll have to say it one more time, Gazpacho. My faves are going to be Beautiful, Afraid of Sunlight, Beyond You, and this last song, King. Before we get to my overall grade, let's get the Joseph's aftermath and final thoughts. He said, although EMI hadn't dropped them quite yet, they may as well have done it as it turns out. Promotion for the album was virtually nil. Basically consisted of H and Mark being flown to Paris for interviews, but they mostly ended up doing all those on the phone anyway. And despite some further positive press reviews, Q had it in their top 50 albums of the year and essentially said, if this album was from a new band with no baggage, it would be hailed as a masterpiece. The commercial decline continued, even from Bray's relatively low bar, becoming the first Marillion studio album to miss the UK top 10 and only reach number 16. And despite being a cheapie, seeing them leave EMI while still owing the label over £500,000, the 1997 to 99 remaster series did most of the work and eventually paying that off. And these days, the band actually gets royalties from the sales of the deluxe editions, which is nice and deserved. Isn't that crazy? They were £500,000 in debt after all the albums they'd made and the success they'd have. JSB says, for this album itself, while I half joked that there are 8 or 9 Marillion albums that could be my favorite, most days if I'm pressed to name just one, it's this one that gets a nod. And it's certainly the H-Era album I generally recommend to people as an entry point. Not that any bugger takes my advice up on that, but that's their loss. Over time, it's settled in the catalog as a band favorite as well. Even Mark has come around to it, noting in his memoir that, quote, I was disappointed with the album, deflated almost, but years later I've reevaluated my opinion of it, and I think it belongs in our top 5 releases. While H has noted, there's never been an initial version or master plan. Like the others, Afraid of Sunlight was another product of flailing around in the darkness. I think it's the best record we've made. So, wow. H agreeing with Joseph here. For me, I think I like Brave better, but you got to remember, guys, I've only heard these albums once. I could see how where the sonic soundscape of this one, along with H's great vocal performances, could really raise this one to the top. But for me right now, I'm still going to beat a really high score. I'm beating an 8.0, but I think I like Brave better, which was the last album, which is much more complicated. If you want to go watch that review, go watch all of them. There's a Marillion playlist down below. But let me know your favorite tracks on here. Where does this stand up in the Marillion catalog for you? Thank you to Joseph, a.k.a. actor JSB, for bringing us this album. Give him some love down in the comments below. And until next time, guys, I will see you.